Can you guys hear me now? Okay, we're getting feedback on that. Damn it. Test. 1, 2. Can you guys hear me now? Moderators? This wouldn't be a venture program taught by Ryan if we didn't have some technical difficulties. So hopefully you guys can hear me now. So we'll just back up for a second and recap with you guys that use these study tips. Hopefully they're helpful for you. And then again, if you haven't joined the study group, please do. It's been really amazing to see all you guys participating in the study group. And really sharing a lot of stuff. And then last week, Brad did such a great job taking the test with us. I was really glad to do that. I'm not brave enough to do that. But I do encourage you to use the practice test as secure education. And let me know if I have any bandwidth issues or any feedback or anything like that. Okay. It's like we're having some video issues here, so bear with me while I try to figure this out. Test 1, 2. Now I have no audio. Can you guys hear me? You should be able to hear me. Just checking. I feel like this is a Verizon commercial. Alright, well, hopefully this is working now, and there's no more echo, and we can move forward. So with that, let's do a check-in. So I do hope that everyone is staying safe and healthy. Very important to do these days. And please let our moderators know how many of you have actually read chapters 1 through 7. And questions. Feel free to submit questions, and the moderators will let me know. And it looks like I'm being asked what our link is for tonight. I think I think Brandon has that. I'll post in the chat here for you. Okay, well, to true form, this is going just as smooth as I had hoped it would earlier today. Diving in, let's get into the quiz. So question 1 here is, during the course of the penetration test, the testers discover signs of an active compromise of the newly custom developed 3-tier web application. What is the best source of action to take? Should you attempt to contain it and eradicate the malicious activity? Should you continue the test? Should you quietly end the test and immediately call the IT operations and escalate the issue? Or should you shut down the server? So as we think about what we learned last week, shutting down the server probably is not the correct answer. We may need to preserve evidence that could be lost if we were to power the server off in a hurry, so I don't think it's that one. Continuing the test, while that might sound like a good idea, if I continue the test past finding an active compromise, I could potentially contribute to corrupting some evidence. So I'm down to A or C. And in this instance, the correct answer is C. You want to quietly end the test and then immediately call the operational IT contact and escalate the issue. This way, you let them know, hey, I found this active compromise. We've got a problem. You guys need to address this. So just make sure to remember that. You will see a similar type of question on the exam. Second question. You would like to have the security firm test the new web application, but have decided not to share the underlying source code. What type of test could be used to help determine the security of the custom web application? So do we use secure compiler warnings? Do we use fuzzing, static testing, or white box testing? Well, if I think about it, and a secure compiler warning, it doesn't really sound like it would be a test, so it's probably not that one. Well, if it's white box testing, then I would have knowledge of potentially have knowledge of the underlying source code, so it's probably not that. So now I'm down to B or C. And static testing is fixed. Again, I'm going to know what I'm doing. So in this instance, we would do fuzzing, and that's the type of testing we're going to do against this web application because we don't have the knowledge of the underlying source code. Question 3, what types of penetration tests will result in the most efficient use of time and hourly consultant expenses? So is that A, an automated knowledge? Is it B, full knowledge? C, partial knowledge? Or D, zero knowledge? And in this instance, the correct answer is full knowledge. So this is the best way to go about doing this to reduce your hourly consultant expenses. Question 4. What term describes a holistic approach for determining the effectiveness of access control and has a broad type of scope? Is it A, a security assessment, B, a security audit, C, a penetration test, or D, a vulnerability assessment? So as we think about a holistic approach, and then we look at the answers here, we can see that a vulnerability assessment isn't necessarily holistic because it's narrow in scope. A penetration test, again, narrow in scope. And a security audit is very specific in scope. So if we're looking for a broad scope, holistic approach, the correct answer here is going to be security assessment. Question 5. What term describes a black box testing method that seeks to identify and test all unique combinations of software inputs? Is it A, combinatorial software testing? Is it B, dynamic testing? C, misuse case testing? Or D, static testing? And the correct answer here is going to be combinatorial software testing. I'm sure I'm butchering that pronunciation. I am a bit tired tonight, so bear with me if I fumble on my tongue. Question 6. What term describes a no-tech or low-tech method that uses the human mind to bypass security controls? Is it A, fuzzing, B, social engineering, C, war dialing, or D, a zero-knowledge test? Well, war dialing we know has nothing to do with the humans. That's a technical situation. Fuzzing we just previously covered, and that also is not utilizing the human mind. So the correct answer here is B. It is social engineering, right? The act of using the human to bypass the security controls by fooling them. Don't see any questions or anything so far from the moderators, so I think we're good to move on, so we'll keep cooking. So we're going to be talking tonight about security operations, foundational concepts, investigations, incident management, and disaster recovery. We're starting on page 363, and we're picking up where we left off last class. Tonight should be relatively light, if you will. It's really good stuff. This is all really good things for us to know, and the majority of us, if we're working in the IT profession today, are probably familiar with a fair amount of this. So let's start with, why is that starting on 2? I don't know why that starts on 2. Looks like I might be missing a slide, so I guess we're going to start with number 2, which is detection. In other words, identification. So here what we're doing is we're saying that we need to be able to detect, based on any of the inputs that we have, of things that we're monitoring. We want to incorporate that into our incident response process. Okay, so we're looking at things like certain log events and certain suspicious behavior on the network events. We're looking for things that could be an indicator or an identifier of something going on. So events correlate to incidences. All incidences are at some point events. Not all events become incidences. Then we have response, right? And so that's going to be our containment phase. And this is when we're trying to decide how severe this issue is, what type of issue this is. Do we need to do a full-blown forensics response? Do we need to protect evidence? while trying to mitigate and limit any damage that could happen and try to prevent any additional damage. And this is where we're going to begin to start our root cause analysis. So in the containment process, we really are trying to figure out what we need to do to contain it and take those steps to get it as contained as we can. Once we have it contained, we want to move on to eradicating it. This is about actually trying to get it out of the environment as much as we can. So as we've contained it, we've kind of understood what it was. Now we start to come up with our eradication strategy or our mitigation strategy. And at this point, we should hopefully have completed the majority of our root cause analysis. If not, we've completed enough of it to be confident in the actions that we're taking, that they will result in a successful eradication of the particular incident in question. So this is getting rid of the bad things, right? And then we need to report. So even though this isn't necessarily a technical step in the process, we do need to have some type of output that occurs so that we can inform our incident responders. We can inform the incident response plan should it need any updates or modifications based on learning. We can communicate to our technical and non-technical staff what is going on, what changes need to be made, and really keep them in the loop. And then we move to recovery. So recovery is going to be trying to get us back to as normal of a state of operations as possible. And recovery should always be accompanied by increased monitoring. You really do want to watch that device and keep a close eye on it to see that your eradication efforts were successful, to monitor for any additional compromise on the device that may not yet have been caught as part of your containment or your root cause analysis. And just as a general rule of thumb, any device or box or system that's been compromised, you generally want to run increased monitoring on that device for a time period of multiple weeks to multiple months. And then you've got the remediation aspects in a broader context. As we identify these things, as we get rid of these things, we might mitigate the risk, but then ultimately we want to get to a point of remediation where we've done our best to limit it or to get it to reduce its impact, to reduce its likelihood, to have taken these steps to prevent this from happening in the future. And then as we implement those remediation plans, we go back to lessons learned. And so, there's kind of this recycling symbol, if you will, and each step should inform the next step. And you always want to do this post-mortem, this last step of lessons learned. Go through the post-incident activity, do the post-mortem, review your reporting. I guarantee you're going to learn something, and you're going to be better prepared for the next event that you have. So the more you get in this habit of continuous improvement and really applying those lessons learned, the better you're going to get at your security game. You're going to drive costs down. There's all kinds of benefits. Don't do this. Don't let your hair get on fire. When you're managing an incident, stay calm. Stay calm won't be on the test, but I can tell you that staying calm during an incident is probably one of the most important things you can do. Now we're going to talk about operational, preventive, and detective controls. We're going to talk about intrusion detection systems and intrusion prevention systems. We're going to talk about true positive, true negative, false positive, and false negative. So in this example, a true positive is that you're getting these alerts from your network intrusion detection system, or NIDS, that the conflicker worm is running around, it's spreading across the trusted network, and you're getting these alerts. So that's a true positive that you have an event going on. A true negative is that your user goes to a site, surfing the web, to an approved site like YouTube or Gmail, Google, and the NIDS is not giving you anything at all. There's no alerts. It's quiet. A false positive would be when the user surfs the web to that allowed site and the NIDS alerts you. So now you've got a network intrusion detection alert for something that's not actually a network intrusion. A false negative is that you have this worm spreading on the trusted network and the network intrusion detection service, their system, is not telling you about it. You're not getting any alerts. So the types that you're going to run into most commonly are NIDS, NIPS, HIDS, and HIPS. So network intrusion detection system, network intrusion prevention system, host intrusion detection system, that's your HIDS, and host intrusion prevention system. And these are the types of detections. NIDS generally require promiscuous network access in order to actually analyze all the traffic. Okay, and this is also going to include your unicast traffic. NIPS, a lot of times, so that network intrusion prevention system, is generally used to identify malicious activity. It's going to record and detect. It's going to record those detected threats. It's going to report on those detected threats, and then it's going to attempt to take preventative actions to stop that threat from actually doing any damage. Okay, so that's that pattern matching, that protocol behavior, and that anomaly detection. These are the things that it's looking at to try to decide whether to throw an alert or whether to take a preventative response action. You know, a lot of times your NIDS, you know, is going to feed directly into your SIM, right? So there's going to be a relationship there because you do want that threat intelligence, you do want those alerts, you know, to go into your SIM and be paired together with the other logging and telemetry that you're collecting to let you get a better picture of what's going on. You want to do continuous monitoring, right? Super important to do continuous monitoring. All of these solutions should be set up for continuous monitoring by default. If for some reason they're not, you want to make sure you get that enabled. And it's part of your larger data loss prevention, right? So this covers network and host because you could be alerted to things like data leaving the environment. The other two that are relatively newer that this book doesn't cover but may be in the next one is perimeter-based intrusion detection, or PIDS, and VM-based intrusion detection, VMIDS. So just know that those things exist. You might run into them in the wild. So here's a picture of what we're looking at. So as you can see, the NIDS here, the way that it's set up, you got something coming in from the internet, goes through the firewall. It's got a read-only up to the NIDS, and then there's this management off-site, or adjacent to the NIDS. That's helping you to keep that NIDS managed. And then you have your trusted network here. Okay, so that's your intrusion detection. And notice that it's read-only, so it's not really able to take any action. It's just alerting you on things it sees. Now here you have intrusion prevention, so network intrusion prevention, or NIPS, and I'm sure someone out there is giggling right now. It's not meant to be inappropriate. You have the internet routes through your firewall, it goes into your NIPS, and then you see here this is bidirectional, and that's notated because it doesn't say that it's read-only. And here you're able to actually take interaction or take action and intercept traffic or run other preventative type of actions, scripts, etc. To help you contain and prevent the issue. If you guys have questions, please feel free to fire them into the chat. We want to give our moderators something to do tonight because I think they're all just sitting around having fun. No, I'm just kidding. Picking fun of the guys because I love them and I can't see them. I can't see any of you, but so be it. So now we're going to talk about operational, preventative, and detective controls, right? So here we're doing, and we've covered these types of controls before, right? Detective controls, preventive controls, and this is just an extension of that knowledge we've already covered. So here you're doing continuous monitoring, right? That's a detective control, and it's saying I'm looking at everything, I'm assessing it, and I'm reassessing it. I'm looking for any kind of deviations, right? That's the idea behind continuous monitoring, is if I know everything that's going on all the time, I know when something's going on that shouldn't be. And it is an improvement to legacy certifications and accreditations. Now you have data loss prevention. So that's a preventative control, right? And basically this is a grouping of solutions that can come in various forms, and there's vendors, and some are hardware-based, some are software-based, appliance-based, etc., etc. But the idea here is that it is going to detect and then prevent data from leaving the organization. And depending on your rules that you've set up, depends on how that would flow. It's generally host-based or network-based, and can also be application-based. So depending on, again, how you've set that up, depends on how it's going to work. So know it, memorize it. I'm going to borrow from Brad on that one. Memorize this. So we also have endpoint security. So we can have HIDs and HIPs on our endpoints. Some of the other preventative and detective controls that you'll find on an endpoint are antivirus, application whitelisting, removable media controls, disk encryption, and privileged access. So these are all different types of preventative or detective controls that you can put onto an endpoint to help increase its operational security. So the most effective one on this list is application whitelisting. And the reason it's the most effective is that you're only allowing pre-approved things. So think of this as like a deny all rule, right? So everything's denied by default, and then I allow this activity under these very narrow and specific circumstances. So that's what your application whitelisting is going to do for you, and it's a great preventative measure if you can get it implemented. There's a whole nother talk we could do on the politics of trying to do something like that, but you'll want to do it. Then we have honeypots and honeynets. And I'm sure some people on the chat are getting excited about this as well. This is one of the fun things, right? So a honeypot is basically a system that you've built realistic enough, but also poor enough that it is attractive to attackers. So the hacker's like, ooh, this looks real. Oh, and it's got really poor security on it, okay? And you notice the note here, very careful, enticement versus entrapment, okay? Honeypots should be used with a great degree of caution, and I definitely would want to work with a lawyer before I would set something up. I want to make sure I'm protected there, right? Because entrapment, not something you can do. Enticement is. You're going to want to learn or research the attack methods, because this what the honeypot's going to allow you to do. So you're going to be able to see the attacker's behavior. You're going to see, what are the exploits that they're leveraging? How are they pivoting if they're pivoting? What kind of foothold are they setting up? Any command and control type of stuff. So that's gonna allow you to see how that attacker is interacting and behaving. You have low interaction systems, which are just fully simulated, and then high interaction, which are actual systems. And then a honeynet is just the network version of that. So honeypot's a system, and a honeynet is a simulated or real network of honeypots. Again, use it with a degree of caution. So probably my most favorite topic in the history of the world is asset management. I literally talk about this every day, at least 2 to 3 times a day. Today alone, I think I'm up to 10. So here we go. Asset management. It is literally the number one thing that you should be starting to do for anything. And it's all about configuration management and asset management. So in this context, I'm going to talk through with you about why we're doing this and what we're doing. Bottom line is most organizations struggle with asset management, and it's the number one thing that they can do to get better at it. So know it and know it well. It will come into play in your job day to day. So what you want to do when you're managing assets and managing the configurations of those assets is you want to harden them as much as possible to your baseline. So you want to try to harden your system images. You want to harden those baseline configurations. The Center for Internet Security has a great matrix. They have this top 20. I encourage you guys to look at it. And then the other thing you want to do when you're hardening a system or hardening its configuration is you want to get rid of anything you don't absolutely need. So you remove those extraneous programs, you disable those services, you want to turn on as many security capabilities as you can. So firewalls, antivirus, IPS, IDS, and then you want to make sure those security and audit logs are properly set up and configured. The harder your system is, the less likely it is to be attacked, and generally the more information you'll have available to help you with any incidents. So this is the Center for Internet Security. This is their benchmarks. They have these CIS benchmarks. Take a look at them. They are the hardening standards and configuration guidelines for a whole host of different technologies. And then the Department of Defense has these STIGs, or Secure Technical Implementation Guide. I love these. I've used them many, many times. They are a really easy way to figure out exactly how hard you can make a system, and then I generally, if it's not a DoD system, have to scale back a couple steps because things don't work because you secured them too much. But know that the STIGs exist. Know that it's about secure configuration management. Why does this matter? Why is this number one? Because it is the basic principle of security. Number one, you're not going to be able to protect or secure anything if you don't know that it exists. So that's asset management, right? You got to know what you have to protect it. And you can't secure things that you can't control. So just because you know the asset exists, if you have no semblance of control or configuration management in place, access control, change control, these types of things, then an unsecured device is just as dangerous because you can't control it, so you can't secure it. So baselining, right, is the process of capturing a point in time and understanding the current system security configuration. You want a baseline so that, again, you can detect deviations from baseline. It's going to help you a lot when it comes to security response. And you should revisit those baselines because as patches get applied, you now have a new baseline. So you do want to do continual baselining. And really what you're looking for is deviations from the baseline. But the takeaway for you guys is asset management, configuration management, baselining. The process of capturing a point in time and understanding the current system security configuration. Lock it away in your brain. Vulnerability management. So this is scanning the system, looking for any kind of missing patches, any vulnerabilities in the code. Vulnerability scanners will only find known vulnerabilities. If no one's discovered it yet, that's a ZeroDay, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But you want to use vulnerability scanning to gain visibility into where your risks are because you have missing patches or poor configurations. And then you want to use management of vulnerability, so vulnerability management, because scanning is knowing, management is then doing something with those results. So you need to have some type of management. The emphasis is on vulnerability management, scanning being part of that. Once you have those results, you prioritize them, and then you begin to remediate your vulnerabilities. So another way to look at that is here. So as you can see, we have a vulnerability that's been discovered. It has a severity of high, so it ranks a 9.3 out of 10. And then there's some additional details on where that particular vulnerability exists and the ports and protocols it's communicating on. Mediums, right? So you got high, medium, low. Myself, I focus on mediums and highs. I have yet to meet anyone that has time to get to lows. And then this is another view. So this is a view from Nessus. It's another type of vulnerability scanner. Greenbone's a vulnerability scanner. And it's going to give you these outputs, these reports. It's going to show you what it scanned, what it found, counts, severities, so on and so forth. So that leads us to the vulnerability management process. So once we've identified and prioritized the assets, right? So back to that asset management, have an inventory, have a hardened system, and then go ahead and look to see what vulnerabilities exist. So use those tools, scan your system, find those vulnerabilities, then fix them, so remediate them. If you can't patch it, then you may need to come up with some creative workarounds to reduce the risk. And that's where the big bucks of security are made, or in creative remediations. And then you want to verify and measure the results of your efforts. You want to see how effective that remediation was. Did it really impact the risk? Did it reduce it? Is that system truly now behaving in a manner that makes it less vulnerable? Sometimes the answer is yes, and sometimes the answer is no. So always inspect your work. And then as you can see, just like all things in the world of security, it is a continuous, ongoing process. Each step should feed and inform the next step. All right, so this is a bit of an eye chart. If we talk about vulnerability management in the context of ISO, this is their definition. And I'm not even going to read all this because this is just too many words, but know that section 12.6 of the ISO IEC 27002, circa 2013, provides guidance on that. So know that vulnerability management's a thing, and know that ISO makes reference to it. So here again, once you have identified a vulnerability, you want to then figure out what risks that vulnerability presents to the system, application, or organization, and then take the appropriate actions to address that. That could be patching. That could be applying other security controls such as enhanced monitoring. If it didn't have antivirus, anti-malware on it, it could be installing that. It could be more aggressive logging. There's many different controls, whitelisting, blacklisting. I mean, you've got a lot of options in the toolkit depending on the vulnerability. Now, depending on how urgent that vulnerability needs to be addressed, different vulnerabilities will present different risk profiles. So if this one is like, whoa, if this gets exploited, we're going to be in the news, we need to get this fixed right now, then you want to carry that out according to the controls related to change management or by following your incident response procedures. Don't Wild West it. Follow some kind of procedure. Always address your critical risk and high risk systems first, and you absolutely need to test your patches before you apply them to make sure that they're effective and that they don't have unintended side effects, such as eating up 3/4 of the processor or knocking the system completely offline or breaking some backwards compatibility. So make sure that you've actually tested those, and then consider any additional controls that you could apply on top of just fixing the vulnerability to again reduce that risk and overall increase or enhance the security of that system. And monitor, monitor, monitor. You'll notice that's been a theme throughout the entire operations section. So as promised, ZeroDay, I mentioned it before, now we're going to get into it. So a ZeroDay vulnerability or a ZeroDay exploit is essentially and we call it an exploit versus a vulnerability. So I'm going to draw the line between a vulnerability and an exploit. A vulnerability says something could happen. There's a potential for something to happen. It could be exploited. An exploit is something that there's actually code out there currently that is exploiting a vulnerability that yet has not been patched. So there's a vulnerability, it's being exploited, and there's no fix for it. That's a ZeroDay exploit. A ZeroDay vulnerability is there's a vulnerability present and it has not yet been patched, but we don't necessarily see that an exploit is actively ongoing. However, take note, exploits can take very little time to create, depending on the nature of the vulnerability. And so a ZeroDay is a vulnerability that nobody has yet solved for. There's no patches, and a ZeroDay exploit is a vulnerability that there are no patches for that's actively being exploited. And if my moderators have a better way to explain that, please do let the team know in chat. Change management. All right, so a system that does not change will become less secure over time. All right, change management is an important thing to do. It is an important process, but there is not an exact science to it. Every organization, and in some cases every system, might be a little bit different for how you manage change on that. As much as possible, try to be consistent across your change management. The general flow of most change management processes are going to include the following. Identifying that a change needs to happen. Like, what is the change? We've identified it. Now we need to propose that we make that change. Now we're going to assess the risk associated with the change. So, we want to put this patch on to fix this vulnerability. Great, that sounds like we're all in support of doing that change. What is the risk to doing it? And what is the risk to not doing it? So these are the types of things that will get talked about in a change management board. They can go by the name of a CRB, a change review board, and then a CAB, a change approval board. Generally, you're going to find that in larger enterprises. But have a change management process. And you want to make sure that you test the change and you have a backup plan. You're going to schedule that change, and then this is a really important step. Most people get in trouble because they skip this step. You need to notify the impacted parties of the change prior to it being implemented, and ideally with as much advance notice as possible. Then you want to implement the change. And after implementing the change, you want to follow up. You want to have a report that comes out that says, we did the change and it went well, or we did the change, it didn't go well and we rolled it back, or whatever that factual statement of the change was. And then you want to really closely track them and audit them. Again, change can be an indicator that something's going on. So if a system has a change occur and there's no corresponding change management record, that could be an indicator that there's suspicious activity. So the better you manage change and document it, the more able you are to tell what's going on when things deviate. So no change management, memorize this stuff. All right, so now we're into continuity of operations. So service level agreements, SLAs, or there are also SLOs, service level objectives. They are different things. For the test, you need to know SLA. And in real life, SLO is kind of where everybody's moving towards. So it's critical that organizations that have external entities that are performing any type of critical service or providing any significant hosting for assets or applications need to be very clear on what the expectations are that you can have as a customer as to what their uptime objectives are, what their service level agreement is, right? And generally a service level agreement says I will fix issues within this much time, I will respond to help desk tickets in this much time, I will ensure the system is up this much time, and that's all going to be defined in that SLA. And so you want to be very clear about the expectations regarding the behavior of the department or organization that is responsible for providing the services, and you want to dig into the quality of those services that are provided. Availability is really a critical security consideration, right, of any service level agreement. You want to know, again, how available is this system. You do need to negotiate all terms of a service level agreement, all the security terms, prior to engaging with the company. So if you're going to set up rules around security, around how things are engaged, who's responsible for what, all these things, you need to hammer that out in advance. And the most common place you're going to run into this these days really is around the cloud computing, right? SaaS-based software, Amazon, AWS, Google Cloud, etc., etc. So now, fault tolerance. And hopefully I'm moving at an okay clip with you guys. I'm not going too fast or too slow. If I need to speed up or slow down, let the moderators know. So fault tolerance, I like to think of fault tolerance as how much pain am I willing to endure? And when I think about it that way, it becomes much easier to wrap my head around it, because that's really what we're saying. So what is our tolerance for fault? So we have backup so that we have recoverability in the event that we have a failure. Okay? Backups come in many different forms, and believe it or not, magnetic tape is still in use a lot, and rumor has it might actually be making a comeback to become the primary dominant long-term backup storage. So you've got your three types of backups. You have a full backup, so that's everything, soup to nuts. Then you have an incremental backup, and this is generally occurring on a schedule, every so often, every couple of hours, every whatever. And then you can have a differential backup, and that's going to be, what has changed between now and then. So incremental is adding backups as you go, and differential is only backing up what's different since the last backup. So full backup, soup to nuts. Incremental, it's additive. And then differential, it is only backing up the difference of what has changed from the previous backup to the differential backup. So full backup, replica of all allocated data on a hard drive, right? This is going to take the most amount of disk. It's going to take the most amount of time. And generally, you use it in conjunction with incremental or differential backups to balance those time and media considerations. So incremental backup are archive files that have changed since the last backup of any kind, and the most recent full backup in and then each incremental backup since the full backup is required to initiate a recovery. So if you're using incremental backups, back to that fat tongue I'm suffering from tonight. Incremental backup is only archiving the files that have changed since the last backup. Okay, and then the time to perform an incremental backup is generally short, but the downside is that a full restore can take many different tapes. You can do depending on how frequent you're doing full backups, you could be doing this for quite some time. And then the odds of a failed restoration rise with each additional tape that you have, or disk, or whatever your backup medium is. And then differential will back up anything that's changed since the last full backup. So I stand corrected. Thank you for these slides. And I hope that highlights for you guys that no matter how much you do this stuff, if you're not working in backups every single day, right, you might forget some of this. So it's so important to study this stuff really hard so that you can pass your exam. And then the reality is you're going to know the stuff you do every day better than anything, but just know this, study these slides, memorize this stuff. So differential then is only the most recent full backup and the most recent differential are required to initiate a full recovery. The longer it goes on between full backups, it's going to increase the time it takes to restore with a differential. All right, more fault tolerance. So in the early days, if a disk died, it died. That was it. Game over. And then somebody said, hey, that's not good, and now we got to have all this expensive disk around, so they came up with this redundant array of inexpensive disks. So what happens is we just jam a whole cluster of hard drives together and make them behave like they're one big giant hard drive so that if one of them fails, we don't lose the whole thing. That's the easiest way that I know of to describe RAID. So it comes in different levels. RAID 0 is going to be your striped set. Okay, so that's the data wrote across the drives as stripes. RAID 1 is a mirror. So what's on drive 1 is also on drive 2. In RAID 0, the data is actually spread across both drives. RAID 3, you have byte level striping with dedicated parity. And honestly, I don't know because I haven't used RAID 3, I don't think ever. So just memorize this. I'm definitely not the RAID expert. I'll be the first to tell you that. RAID 4, it's going to be block level striping with dedicated parity. Parity is going to be this bit that indicates where things match back to. We've got RAID 6, that's block level striping with double distributed parity. Most people are using 0, 5, and 10 is not on here, but so here we go. Again, 3 terms that are important to understand with RAID are mirroring, striping, and parity. So mirroring, you're going to get that full data redundancy. It's exactly what it sounds like. It is a duplicate. Drive A and Drive B have the exact same stuff. Write times are going to be slower. Read times are going to be faster. It is most costly in terms of disk because half of the drives are literally just being used for redundancy. Striping is going to increase the read and write performance by spreading the data across multiple disks. So reads and writes can be performed in parallel across multiple disks rather than serially on one disk. And parallelization is going to provide a performance increase, but it does not aid in data redundancy. And parity achieve data redundancy without incurring the same degree of cost as mirroring does in terms of disk usage and write performance. So memorize these terms. Ooh, we got pictures. Yay! I probably should have looked at this before I presented it, but hey, sometimes you just gotta wing it. So RAID 0 is a stripe set. So striping to increase performance of read and write. And then again, no data redundancy. So if recoverability is a high concern, you don't want to use this. If speed is the concern, you do. And a mirrored set, the one I understand best, is exactly that. It's a full duplicate, right? So if we look here again, we see A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. So it's striped across. This is a full mirror. RAID 1 mirror. And then there's RAID 2 Hamming code. So not considered commercially viable for hard disks and is not used. And I'm sure all of you are starting to love how much material is in this exam that's not used, but it is what it is. Requires either 14 or 39 hard disks and is specifically designed hardware controller. It's highly cost prohibitive and it's likely not to be on the exam. So RAID 3 stripe set with dedicated parity byte level. So data at the byte level is striped across multiple disks. Additional disk is leveraged for the storage of the parity information, which is then used for recovery in the event of a failure. RAID 4 stripe set with dedicated parity at the block level, so not byte level, but block level. Exact same configuration and functionality of RAID 3, but the stripes are at the block rather than the byte. And then it also has a dedicated parity drive rather than having parity data distributed among all the disks. So in RAID 5, that parity is across all the disks. and that is stripe set with distributed parity. So RAID 5 is super common. It's going to leverage that block level striping. It's going to write parity information for recovery purposes across all the disks. It's going to distribute that. The disk cost for redundancy is lower than that of a mirrored set, and it supports hardware and software-based implementation. And if you have a single disk fail, it allows for data recovery. So this is what RAID 5 looks like. And you see the parity. A1, A2, B2, 3, so on and so forth. All right. RAID 6, so stripe set with dual distributed parity, can allow for the failure of 2 drives and still function. Redundancy is achieved by writing the same parity information to 2 different disks. And then RAID 1+0 or RAID 10 is known as nested RAID or multi-RAID. And it's one RAID level encapsulated within another. And it is a striped set of mirrors. So it basically leverages the best of both. All right, system redundancy. So again, definition of fault tolerance. How much pain am I willing to endure? So myself personally, I don't like pain too much. So I try to have redundant as much as I can, redundant systems. So, redundant hardware. So you can have built-in redundancy. Multiple power supplies, multiple disk controllers, multiple NICs. If you've ever been in a data center and you've ever opened up a modern server rack, you're going to see exactly that, right? Redundant power supplies, redundant disk controllers, and redundant NICs. That way, if any one of those pieces of equipment has a failure, I don't actually have a system outage. I just have a component outage. However, maintaining an inventory of spare modules is going to be less expensive than having all of the servers configured with redundant power. So depending on your fault tolerance and depending on the sensitivity of that system, it may be more cost effective to keep spare parts on hand versus running spare parts in the box. And then you have redundant systems. So that's entire systems. They are secondary, complete clones of the systems that they are meant to help recover. And a lot of organizations have some kind of SLA in place with a hardware manufacturer to make sure that they can get that replacement equipment very quickly in the event that they need it. So the other big thing that we're going to get into tonight is BCP and DRP, so Business Continuity Plan and Disaster Recovery Plan. You'll notice a lot of orange on this slide, so this is definitely one to memorize. So a business continuity plan is that long-term plan to ensure the continuity of business operations. Pretty much anybody that didn't have a pandemic plan in place today has now added that type of interruption to their business continuity plan. How do I continue to do business when I can only do curbside pickup? How do I, continue my business when, certain things happen? How am I ensuring the long-term operations of my business to ensure that it can continue even if I have challenges? So then I have a continue of operations plan. So this is saying that I want to maintain operations during the disaster. I want to continue operations. I don't want to have to be interrupted. And so what is my continuity of operations plan, or my COOP? Disaster, it's any event that interrupts normal system operations, right? Could be physical, could be technical, could be somebody tripped over a cable in the data center. Let's hope not, but it can happen. Then you got a DRP, that's your disaster recovery plan. So that's the actual detailed plan that you're going to use to recover from disaster. Good disaster recovery plans account for different types of disasters. Any disaster recovery plan should account for the specific steps needed, order of operations needed, and human beings needed to restore systems in a timely fashion and order to allow for the recovery of the business and of those systems. And then the metric of mean time between failures is a measurement of how long a system will run on average before failing. Everything breaks. We know this. Computers break, software breaks, cars, break down, and everything kind of has a shelf life. Good Lord, it's a long day. And so what we're saying here is what's the time in between those failures? And then there's mean time to repair. How long is it going to take me to recover a failed system? And these are metrics you need to know. Memorize it. So BCP, again, continuity. It's all about continuing to operate before, throughout, and after a disaster. It's generally focused on the business as a whole, and it thinks in more of a long-term strategy. It does take into account things such as people, critical records, vital records, process, and any additional information around critical systems. A disaster recovery plan is going to be more tactical in nature. And again, it's that detailed document to help you walk through the specific steps. It is meant as a guide to use in the now, to get recovered now. It's not thinking about long-term business impact. That's going to be what that business continuity plan is all about. So they do share a relationship. Business continuities, think of it like an umbrella. It's an umbrella plan, right? And it's going to include additional plans, such as the disaster recovery plan. So you have two different plans which have different scopes but are interconnected or intertwined. The disaster recovery plan serves as a subset of the overall business continuity. And for more in-depth detail on this, NIST Special Publication 834 has a visual mean for understanding the interrelation between the BCP and the DR, as well as the continuity of operations plan and the occupant emergency plan, among others. So it looks a little something like this. So as you can see, we've got this kind of broken up. So protect, we've got our crisis communication plan and our occupant emergency plan. This is in our protect phase. You notice that the legend here, this indicates a facility, and this indicates the business. Okay? And then we move into sustain. Well, that's continuity of operations plan. That's a major impact type event. How am I going to keep business running? Then I'm in my recover and resume. And this is where my incident response plan, so my cyber incident response plan. This is also then, and you notice here from the legend, this is IT. The stripes mean it's IT's issue. And then there's the continuity of support plan / IT contingency plan, which a lot of times will result in invoking the disaster recovery plan. And then there's the business recovery or resumption plan, or the BRP. Okay? And that's, now that we've recovered systems, what are the additional business processes, steps? Do we need to communicate to users? What does that look like? How are we going to get back on our feet? And then, as with all good things, the recycle symbol applies. Everything should inform everything else. So when you get on the backside of a disaster, the first thing you want to do is go look at how you did, do your post-mortem, and see if you need to make any adjustments to your communication plans, to your continuity plans, operations plans, so on and so forth. All right, so classifications of disasters or disruptive events. The three most common ways of categorizing the causes for disasters are, whether the threat the threat agent is natural, human, or environmental. So natural, this is the one everybody gets, right? Tornadoes, earthquakes, hurricanes, flood fire, act of God stuff. Then you have the human disaster. So this could be, phishing and social engineering and insiders, DOS, DDoS, hacktivism, terrorism. In the case of schools, it's curious students. It's all kinds of stuff. There are unintentional threats that can come from the humans. That's where somebody inadvertently sends the spreadsheet of W-2s to the wrong email address. Whether that was from laziness, carelessness, etc. Being all sleepy from the COVID and you make a mistake, you click the wrong thing. So there's, intentional human threats and unintentional human threats. Then you've got environmental. And this is really talking about the information systems or data center environment. These are things like, blackouts, brownouts, the server, the cooling fan died and the processor melted. Software's, buggy and full of flaws. So that can be those environmental. You want to understand the likelihoods and the impacts. These are an important part of the BCP and DRP process. You don't want to waste time on things that are super unlikely to happen. By the same token, you don't want to ignore something that is got a very high likelihood of happening. So here's another example of disruptive event and the type of event that is. So this is important to understand because this was something you may see on the exam, right? You'll be asked to classify the type of event or classify the type of disruptive event. So here you can see earthquake is natural, strike, well, that's intentional. People chose to go on strike. Terrorism's intentional. It's also a technical because it's not always a human doing it. And then here you can see like errors and omissions, right? That's unintentional human. And then fire or failure of equipment, environmental. So then we have, errors and omissions, right? So kind of touched on this in the previous slide. It's when humans make mistakes, not on purpose. They fat finger the keyboard. I got an email the other day for a Ryan Cloutier that's not me, right? Because somebody made an error. They didn't double check the address. So that's going to fall under your errors and omissions. Then you've got your natural disasters. These are your earthquakes, your floods, your tsunamis, COVID, right? COVID's a natural disaster at this point. There's a low likelihood of occurring, but as we're all learning firsthand, the impact can be really severe. So this is the earthquake index. And so we're looking at this to see how likely, so remember back to 2 slides ago, we want to look at how likely the event is. Well, living here in Minnesota, there is a very low likelihood of an earthquake, but we're more likely to have an earthquake issue than a volcano issue, right? So here in, where we live in Minnesota and where the offices are in Minnetonka, earthquake, probably not going to happen, but it could. Volcano, really, really unlikely. A tornado, though, yeah, that's actually pretty likely. And if you notice, Minnetonka specifically, because of where it's located geographically here in the state, seems to rank significantly higher than the state as a whole. Mainly because most of our state is in the north, closer towards Canada, and as Evan likes to say, you're welcome, we keep you safe from Canada. And up there, it's a lot more forest, and generally they don't get the severe weather that results in tornadoes. But there are other types of extreme weather events here in Minnesota, and if you notice, our most common is hail, and the next most common is heavy snow, and then a special type of heavy snow, when accompanied by wind, is called a blizzard. So that's really the type of stuff that we're looking out for. So you're going to want to do something similar like this whenever you're doing any kind of DR planning. So then we have our electrical and power problems. And, if you're me presenting a CISSP class, you could also have internet problems. And that's going to be that disruptive event, right? You've got, UPSs and backup generators to compensate for lack of power. Make sure that they're in place. You could have temperature and humidity issues. If you're not monitoring for temperature in your data center, you could have heat issues if an AC unit fails. That can happen. And it's important to note the mean time between failures for electrical equipment will decrease if it's operating in a hot or wet environment. Computers are not fans, electrical equipment in general, not fans of high heat or high humidity. Then we have disasters and disruptive events of the warfare, terrorism, and sabotage. So these are the human intentional threats. This is where bad people are just being bad because they suck. So we have cyber warfare. Threats going to vary dramatically based on your geographic location, your industry, the value of your brand. I mean, there's so many factors that can go into how risky you are to be a target. The Aurora attacks, were a type of attack that got named because the name Aurora was found in a sample of the malware that were used. But it was a series of online attacks against Google and other American corporations, and then they were able to trace that back to 2 educational institutions in China, and one had close ties to the Chinese military, according to the people in the investigation. And then, probably the one most of us are familiar with is the financially motivated attackers, right? They're trying to steal credit card data, personal information, do data dumps, pump and dump on stocks, schemes, scams, all that stuff, organized crime. And then, personal shortage can be another type of issue, right? You can have serious disruption if staff aren't available to help or aren't there to take care of some of those critical processes that are people dependent. So as you can see here, the threat actor motives, financial, still the top, right? They go where the money is. Bad guys love to go after the money. The next big one is going to be your espionage, right? And then kind of everything else below that is down here, right? We are seeing a little bit of this one go back up, and we're seeing this one go back up. So obviously this diagram's from 2016. If you look at some of the newer numbers, these things are back on the rise. All right, so interestingly enough, this slide deck was made before COVID. And what do we talk about? Pandemics and disease. So major biological problems like COVID can seriously disrupt and lead to personnel shortages, right? Somebody's out sick on quarantine and they need to be there in person to service something in the data center. That can be a challenge. Strikes, so people just walking off the job, that can have a direct impact. And then any sudden separation of employment. So, if somebody leaves the organization voluntarily or involuntarily, or ceases to be part of the world due to an unfortunate set of events, you could have a critical member of the workforce suddenly leave, which could lead to some issues with personnel. Then we have communication failures. So we really rely heavily on our IP phones, internet access, if we're using SaaS-based applications. I don't know what a SaaS-bass is, but I feel like Evan's going to make a graphic now that I said it. One of the most common disaster-causing events is the lines being cut. It's amazing how often people cut lines. Actually, my mother-in-law is a location provider. She has a company that does location services for those lines. And she's out on a call at least once a month because somebody took a backhoe and ripped some fiber out of the ground. So just know that can happen. It does happen a lot. And then one of the big impacts of Hurricane Katrina was an outage of internet too, right? So Hurricane Katrina knocked out some stuff, which then resulted in some of the major long hauls being disrupted. And that was a bit of an issue that had to be worked through. Obviously, as always, it's been said before, but I'll say it again. Human life trumps everything. So always, always, always personnel safety. It absolutely has to be the top priority, right? So as you think about these things and how you're going to recover from what types of disasters and the different types of events, you absolutely need to make sure that personnel safety is top priority. If you're unable to secure the facility because of the disaster event, you may need to take additional measures to ensure that you can protect your personnel. So the first step of any disaster recovery process is responding to it. So it's becoming aware the issue exists and beginning to assess the amount of damage. You really want to move as quick here as you can, at least in your initial assessment. You can always go deeper, but you do want to get a good gut feel quickly as possible as to how big is this, how deep is this. So the initial assessment is going to determine whether you truly have a disaster or not. Or do you just have a significant outage? Not every outage qualifies as a full-blown disaster. So as you look at that, again, you really want to focus on that personnel safety. You want to make sure that people can stay safe. And as long as they can stay safe, you're pretty good there. But if for any reason you run into something that they can't stay safe, you got to take care of that first. Then if you determine through this initial response that there is an actual disaster to be addressed, it's time to activate the team. So you need to get all hands on deck for everyone that's going to be involved in the recovery process, and then you need to actually activate the team and start to work through the plan. So here you're going to say, okay, we've had an issue. Now you want to make sure you communicate. One of the most important things in disaster recovery is keeping the right folks up to date on what's going on. A lot of times you're going to require out-of-band communication. So this is going to be using your cell phones to text each other. If you still have a landline, it's going to be using a landline, right? Because the IP phones are maybe dead. So you gotta make sure you have that stuff thought of and set up ahead of time, and so that you can be able to communicate. You also need to be able to provide external communication. So this could be like media communications, PR communications, communications with customers, anything like that. So once you've got your communication up, then you want to move to assess. So assess, now we're going to be going more deep into this. We're going to dive into the details. We're going to look at what really happened, how bad is the damage, what do we need to do? And that's all going to be relative to the type of disaster you're having, right? So you need to figure out what's really occurred and what are the proper steps to achieve recovery, but also to do this prior to achieving maximum tolerable downtime, MTD, otherwise known as a resume creating event. This is your drop dead. Like the business has said, under no circumstance can we be down for greater than 8 hours, or whatever threshold they've set for their maximum tolerable downtime. So you want to make sure that your recovery allows you to get stood back up prior to achieving that. And then you want to make recommendations for ultimate restoration or reconstruction at an alternate site. So if your primary location is unable to be recovered due to a natural disaster, you may need to start thinking about spinning up your secondary location. So now you have reconstitution. So that is, you've successfully recovered all the critical business operations at either the primary or the secondary site. And then if you have leveraged the secondary site, you want to make sure that all the necessary safety and security controls are in place in order to maintain the expected degree of security that you normally have. And then you want to deploy your salvage team to begin the actual recovery process at the primary facility. So again, more commonplace in a physical disaster scenario or a catastrophic loss of network connection or something like that. But if you've actually had like a halon event or a fire event or anything, you may need to send in the salvage team to make sure you can securely recover any information that might be present, because now there's a hole in the wall of the data center that anybody could walk through. So to do all this, you've got to create a BCP DRP, right? Before you can implement it, you've got to create it. So the high-level steps, if you look at the 834, are initiating the project. So it's just creating the project, saying, hey, we're going to do this as a thing, we're going to put energy into this. Then we're going to scope it out. So what's it going to be, what's in scope, what's out of scope. Then we're going to do a business impact analysis. Identify the preventive controls, do the recovery strategy, plan, design, and development, activities that need to happen, implementation, training, and testing, and then the maintenance of it. So get comfortable with the 834. It's a really good doc. So to initiate, right, we want to first develop the contingency planning policy statement. Again, reminder, if it's orange, really work hard to remember this. So a formal department or agency provides some type of authority necessary to create the plan. So did you get buy-in from the bosses, right? And then the very next step to that is, once you're approved to move forward with the plan, you need to conduct a business impact analysis. And what this is this is essentially an interview process that's going to allow you to figure out what are the critical business processes and systems, components, personnel, etc., that are the absolute bare minimum the business needs to operate. It's also going to help you understand what the absence of a system, what that impact is to the business. So maybe they could be without a system for a couple of hours, but they can't be without it for a couple of days. So you'll tease all that information out during the business impact analysis. Then you're going to look at what are the preventative controls that we can put in place. How can we reduce the effect of system disruption? How do we increase system availability and reduce the cost of contingency lifecycle? So what are the things that we can do as preventative measures? Having good backups, having offsite backups. Like, these are all things we can do as preventative measures. Then we need to think about, the scope. And as we develop the scope and we get it determined and agreed upon, there's 7 milestones here within that scope definition. And we look at the first 3, and then these ones now are, what are the recovery strategies? So how am I getting this system back on its feet? Am I restoring from backup? Am I spinning up a secondary system? Was it a high availability system? It automatically failed over. What does that look like? What do I got to do to get recovered quickly and effectively if I've had any kind of disruption? And then I want to have an IT contingency plan. Okay, so this is going to be the actual, this is what you do, step-by-step guidance and detailed procedures for restoring a damaged system. Sometimes the order of operations in which you restore a system or its software components can have a direct impact on that system. Some things are dependent on other things to have been done first, so make sure you understand what that looks like. And then, this is super important, plan, test, and train. A BCP and a DRP don't do you any good if you've never actually tested it. So make sure you're testing. All plans are great until you have to use them, and then all of a sudden you find holes. So the more often that you test that plan, the quicker you're going to be able to find those gaps, the better you're going to be able to cover any training gaps, new activities, and just overall preparedness. So please plan, test, train, and do exercises. And then maintain it. Any BCP or DRP should be considered a living document and should be maintained and kept up to date as best as possible. Okay? Because things change, and so your plan should reflect current affairs. You got to have leadership buy-in. Anything that you do, you need C-level managers to support. They've got to back it. They've got to agree to the plan that you intend to do. They need to support any actions of items that are listed in that plan. Because this could be things like spending money and calling in, assistance or buying new servers, right? So you want to make sure that that's all been clearly laid out in advance and it's approved so that you can move with speed. So you're going to want to, involve the CEO, the COO, the CIO, the CFO. And you need to be they need to be empowered and have enough power and authority to speak for the entire organization. So you've got to identify the person that's allowed to go on TV and talk about what's happening with the media. And they need to be high enough in the organization to actually be able to commit financial resources. When I'm trying to get management support, I focus on getting buy-in from all of these folks, from the CEO, the COO, the CIO, and the CFO. It just makes it easier. So make sure you've got that buy-in. Very important part. Then there's other roles within the BCP DRP. And because this is generally a chaos type situation, you want to make sure this is all thoroughly mapped out in advance so that you know who to call, who's on first, who's on second. So you need that key point of contact to making sure that the BCP DR has been tested. You want to have a good manager and leader, you want them present because if you do have to cause the BCP or DRP to be implemented, having the better the leader is, the smoother the process is going to be, right? Nobody likes working for a jerk. You want to make sure you have a point of contact list for every person within the organization during a crisis. The test will not ask for this, but real life tells me print that out. Keep a hard copy somewhere. You need to be very organized. So you guys, that's why testing is so important. You want to make sure this person in this role is highly organized. They need to have a lot of credibility and enough authority to make critical decisions. So as we're moving through this at a high speed, we need to be able to make rapid fire decisions that have potential, impact. And so this individual needs to have enough political weight, if you will, and credibility in the org. They don't need any technical skills. They don't really need to have in-depth technical skills. They need to be able, though, to understand the urgency and importance of an ask and to be able to support you in getting that through. Then you have the continuity planning project team. So this is going to be all the personnel that have some role to play when the emergency occurs. And it generally should be comprised of stakeholders from within and across the organization. And really you want to focus on those individuals that will play a specific role if a specific emergency occurs. So you could have different teams, different team members based on different event types, based on different lines of business. So in a very large organization, you could have multiple lines of business and end up having several different teams as well as plans. You generally want to have folks available from human resources, from the PR team, the IT staff, physical security, essential personnel, and anybody else really that's going to be essential for critical business functions. You want to have them involved on the team, even if they're not doing technical work. Now you want to scope it, and scoping is really, you want to start narrow and then work your way towards broad. The reason you want to do that is focusing on your critical assets first, focusing on your critical business processes first makes this a lot easier to get buy-in, makes it a lot easier to do the planning and to ultimately execute it. It's very important to understand what is in and also, equally important, what is out of scope. Once you get approval from C-level, then you can start to figure out the rest of the objectives and deliverables. But first you have to define scope and make sure you're crystal clear and everybody's on board. Generally, objectives are going to be created as if-then. So if this happens, then these things happen. These people get involved. If there's a hurricane, then we enact Plan H, right? Plan H for hurricane. And then we relocate everybody using our physical relocation and employee safety plan. Plan H is unique to our organization, but it does not cover all the other sub-plans required. So the objective would be to create this plan and then have it reviewed by everybody by a specific date. And then the objective will have a number of deliverables required to create and fully vet the plan. So for example, draft documents, exercise planning meetings, tabletop preliminary exercises, so on and so forth. Executive management needs to at least ensure that the support is given for these three things, right? So they need to support the initiating of the plan, they need to support the final approval of the plan, and then they need to demonstrate due care and due diligence and be held liable under applicable laws and regulations. So making sure that they've got skin in the game. So accessing the critical state, right? So assessing, good God, it's been a long day. All right, assessing the critical state can be difficult because determining which pieces of the infrastructure are critical depends on how it supports the users within the organization. So an example I'll give you, a payroll system may not be critical every day but payday. But on payday, oh boy, that's the most critical system in your organization. So you can actually have a system that the criticality of it could potentially change based on season of business, based on all these different business factors. So you want to make sure you get that critical state and asset list together because, again, that's all about that BIA. What happens if this goes away? Can this be gone for 2 hours or does this have to be back in 10 minutes? The more you understand those details, the easier it is to build your plan and the specific objectives of it. So this is a good example, right? So the IT asset is mapping software. The affected group of users are delivery drivers. The business process that will be affected is the timely delivery of goods, and the impact to the business then is customer relations and trust may be damaged. Timekeeping, right? So back to my payroll example. Well, that's everybody. And the business process affected is, keeping track of time and making sure people get paid. And, the business impact is that late paychecks are tolerable for a very short period, 5 days. And in my case, not 5 days, much less, right? Like, I don't know about you guys, but we all show up to do our jobs, A, because we love it, but B, because we're getting paid. So not getting paid generally results in people not wanting to show up to work. So, make sure that people get paid on time, right? And in this case, the last example, Lotus Notes, the executive board, financing and accounting are unable to access those systems. That can create all kinds of other issues, political issues and so on and so forth, financial groups and communications with the executive committee, right? In this case, it's a mild impact because the financial group can also use email. So they have an alternative means of communicating. Now, if this was Lotus Notes and email, business impact would be much, much higher. So you want to conduct that BIA. Try to be as formal with it as you can. You want to be consistent in how you are analyzing and identifying these critical assets. So you want to be asking the business consistent questions. Try to maintain deviation unless that deviation is specific to their line of business and not applicable to anyone else. And you want to give that BCP DRP project manager, you want them to fully characterize the contingency requirements and priorities. So what's got to come back first, what's got to come back second. I can't restore everything at once, so I need to know order of operations and what's more important in a hierarchy. So then you want to correlate the IT system components with the service that it supports. So you could have a web server that is supporting a critical web app that the business uses to conduct global trading or something like that, if they're in a commodities industry, right? So you want to understand what is the service the business provides and what is the supporting technology and system components of that service. You want to try to quantify the consequences of disruption as much as you can. So, again, the absence of, what does that result in for us? And you want to determine the maximum tolerable downtime, or MTD, for a specific IT asset. It's important to understand how long it can actually be down before it's a major problem. And then that helps inform the business around their processes and efficiencies, because it's detailing out all this stuff. So it can actually be helpful to the business. All right, so identify those critical assets. Again, what's critical to the organization? Even if it seems trivial or unimportant, it's there for a reason, so what does it do and what is it supporting? Then you want to do the BCP-DR risk assessment. So again, what risks are inherent to these assets? It's also advisable to do a vulnerability analysis for any of those major critical systems. So here's a visual of that, right? Server located in an unlocked room, physical access by an unauthorized person, impact to the business, loss of confidentiality and integrity availability for the email system through physical attack, right? How do you mitigate that? Well, you could install locks on the door with a PIN alarm system, and you can then, by doing that, reduce the risk to an acceptable level, okay? Same thing here, no firewall. Well, that's a huge issue because wide open internet, again, loss of CIA. So you're going to now move the email server to a hosted managed site, and now you've transferred risk to a hosting organization. So again, understand what the risk findings are, what the vulnerabilities are, what the impacts are, what the potential mitigation steps are. So to figure out that maximum tolerable downtime, again, I like to think of this again as how much pain, right? How long can this be down before things get really bad? You also want to factor in the time it takes to actually go through the reconstruction phase. So the two metrics that are going to tell you what your MTD are your RTO and your WRT, so your recovery time objective. What is my objective for getting the system back up on its feet, and what is the amount of work recovery time needed to do that? Okay, so if they say have the system back up on its feet in 8 hours and my WRT is 4 hours, I'm going to factor that into my maximum tolerable downtime. It also goes by other names because, hey, why not? IT security, we love to name things 50 different things. So you have maximum allowable downtime, or MAD, maximum tolerable outage, MTO, and maximum acceptable outage, MAO. So, it comes in several flavors. All of them mean the same thing. So you want your failure and recovery metrics, right? So these again are the metrics of RPO. So what's your recovery point? How much data am I comfortable losing? Recovery time, how fast do I need this back? Work recovery, how much effort do I need to get this done? Mean time between failures, how long before this happens again? Mean time to repair, how long is it going to take me to get this fixed once it's happened? Minimum operation requirements, right? So MOR. So that's, what are the absolute minimums for restoring this service? I might not have all the bells and whistles back, but I have enough back to recover the business process. So again, RPO, how much data, right? If you perform weekly backups, somebody said we could lose a week's worth of data. If it's Sunday to Saturday, then you would have lost an entire week's worth of data. So the RPO for this is 1 week. It is the amount of data or work loss that you find acceptable. Recovery time objective and work recovery time. So again, describes the maximum time allowed for the recovery of the system. Work recovery is how much time required to get that recovered system, operational. And downtime is going to be RTO plus WRT, right? So MTD, or the 800 other incantations it comes in. What's my RTO plus my work effort? Mean time between failures. So again, how long will this system run before failing? You know, it really depends on the components and the hardware. A lot of times software isn't really the issue here. It's more, you know, how many cycles can I get out of a monitor? How many cycles can I get out of a cooling fan? You know, these types of things. So in this case, 100 LCD monitors, you know, running for 14 days at 24 hours a day. One failure would be, you know, one failure would 33,600 hours, right? So as you're calculating that, it's, you know, how long can I run this for before just one of them, you know, fails. The BCP DRP is the team is going to determine the correct amount of expected failures within the systems given a course of time. And then calculating the MTBF, or mean time between failure, becomes less relevant or less reliant when an organization uses fewer and fewer hardware assets. Mean time to repair, so again, how long to recover this thing, how long to get it reconstitute it, to get it up so that we can actually get back to business. And then the minimum operating requirements. Literally, what is the least amount of things required to get this operational? Because we can always add additional functionality later. In an emergency situation, we want to make sure we get things recovered quickly. Alright, so preventative controls are those controls that are going to prevent disruptive events from having an impact. So as you do that BIA, it's going to identify risks that you can potentially mitigate immediately using preventative controls. Alright, once you've got your BIA complete, then the BCP team knows what the maximum tolerable downtime is, so they have that metric, as well as the other metrics of RTO, RPO, and they're going to use that to figure out the recovery strategy. So what type of steps need to be taken? How, you know, do I store things, you know, in a, you know, cold, warm, hot, redundant? You know, how available are my systems? All those metrics that we gather in the BIA are going to help us make these decisions. And as you can see on this matrix, it's cost to implement versus availability. The most expensive solution is a fully redundant, hot, active. Right? So I've got a duplicate site, a completely duplicate site that is running, it's on, it's ready, it's waiting for a DNS cutover. Okay? That's my most expensive. My next one's a hot site. So the hot site, it's up, it's on, it's ready, but I got to do more configuration to activate it. I might need to, you know, take some additional steps. It's not a fully redundant copy. I may need to copy over the last, you know, 6 or 8 hours of data or something like that. And a warm site is that, you know, boxes are on, they're running. They're not fully ready yet, though, to go live. They still need some configuration. There might be some installations that need to be done, but they're there and they're available. A cold site, things have been set up, but they're turned off. Or they could just be backups that you have to do a rebuild. I've seen cold sites where it's, you know, frozen VM snapshots and other things like that. So a cold site, again, is you know, I've got it, it's there, but I got to do a lot of work to get it up to a point of recovery. And then obviously at the lowest end of the spectrum and the lowest cost, just don't have a plan. Now, I would argue the cost to implement no plan actually goes up tremendously, because when you have an event, now you're really going to be paying the piper. So part of that recovery strategy is going to be supply chain management, right? So now that we have just-in-time goods, a lot of times we don't maintain on-hand stock. We say, well, Dell can ship that to me in 24 hours or whatever, right? And as long as your metrics that you've identified in your BIA allow for that, that's fine. But you want to make sure that you have the goods necessary on hand to recover within the time frames that have been agreed to. Some manufacturers are going to offer you guaranteed replacement insurance for specific types of disasters. Generally, that's priced per server. It'll be in that SLA, so very important to know what's in your SLA. And really, all forms of relevant insurance should be analyzed by the BCP team. So if you're going to rely on it, make sure that it's been looked at and that it is going to actually do what you think it will when you need it. Telecommunications management, right? So very important to make sure that we can maintain communication. We need to be able to talk to each other. We need to be able to potentially talk to the outside world. And one of the first processes that fails during a disaster is communication. Depending on the types of circuits, you may have to do specific things to address that. And a lot of times you can get power provided by a generator if you need to. But you want to make sure you can get those communications back up and running, because that's a really important part of business. And then you have utility management, right? So as you think about your recovery strategy, how am I going to manage utility? Do I have multiple power drops? Do I have a single power drop? Is there a generator on site? What happens when my power, my water, or my gas go away because of a disaster? Do I have alternative options for that? Okay, and you want to think about power, heating, cooling, and water, right? People need water. You want to address those specific sections and any unavailability of that required utility, and then come up with some kind of option to offset the absence of. The recovery options is, once you've figured out what your maximum tolerable downtime is, then you can figure out what your recovery options are that fits that. So for example, a 10-day MTD indicates that a cold site is probably a reasonable option. I can probably get my environment stood back up in a cold site within 10 days. So I might think a cold site's a good idea. But if I only have a couple of hours, then I'm thinking redundant or hot. I'm thinking, how fast can I get things stood back up? Redundant site is it's an exact duplicate of the system, and it can do, as far as the end user is concerned, there is no loss of service, right? Those cutovers happen automatically. But basically, something's watching, and as soon as it sees that there's a loss of connection or activity, it takes over as the primary device. They get back up in real time, so that there is no loss of any data. And they're super duper duper expensive to run because it's basically a complete duplicate of your infrastructure. A hot site is going to be, generally some kind of data center, right? It's going to have the computers, they're ready to go. A lot of times we'll already have all the apps installed, data is being mirrored in real time, but there might be some additional steps that you need to take to recover critical operations. And a lot of times, if you've configured it right, you can recover in less than an hour. They're going to have the same technical, physical, and administrative controls that you have at the production site. Okay. Warm site, it's got some of the stuff a hot site has, but it generally relies on backup restoration. And again, here this option is good if you can be down for 1 to 3 days. The longer the MTD is, the less expensive the recovery will be. And so, again, it's important as you think about this stuff to go in and look at how long these things are going to take to get done, right? And you want to go with that option. Again, orange, right? 1 to 3 days. So the longer it is, the less expensive it is, but also the longer you're done. Cold site is the least expensive. Nothing's there, right? You can set things up there. You've got a rack, you've got some power, you've got some physical security, right? But you're probably trucking in some replacement servers. You're probably running backups via USB or something crazy like that. Then you have a reciprocal agreement. So this is where two organizations decide that in the event of a disaster, another organization can move in and share space. You'll want to have that formed in a contract. They're also known as mutual aid agreements, and they can come in really handy. So if there's another business of equal size, you can make an agreement with them to say, hey, look, can we use your offices or your set up in part of your data center or something like that. And then you have a mobile site, so data centers on wheels, right? And they can have things like HVAC, fire suppression, physical security. If you have a flood in the data center, they'll bring this on site. They'll get you back up and running. A lot of times they're defended by fences, gates, security cameras, so on and so forth. Then there's subscription services. So you can outsource the BCP DR. Another company will come in and actually do that for you, and then you can transfer the risk to the insurer company through that. And a lot of them have built models around that. IBM has one. There's a lot of organizations that'll help you get a DCP BR set up, and they'll also help you implement it in the event that you need to. And then we have the related plans that go under that umbrella plan of the BCP. So that's our disaster recovery plan, our continuity of operations plan, our business resumption or recovery plan, our continuity of support plan, our cyber incident response plan, our occupant emergency plan, and our crisis management plan. Okay? Memorize those. Here's another good example. I'm not going to read all this just yet, but just know that, again, there's plan, there's purpose, there's scope, and you want to make sure that the plans align to their purpose and their scope. The one I will pick apart is the crisis communication, because I've seen this so many times where this failed, and that's making sure that you have procedures to properly report to your personnel and to the public, right? This is not an IT thing. This is a PR thing. This is a communications department issue. But they are part of that larger business continuity plan. So continuity operations, this is going to describe the procedures required to maintain operations during the disaster. This could be transferring of personnel to a secondary location, and how the operations of that site are going to flow. You've got your business recovery plan, also known as business resumption plan, and then again, this is detailing out the steps needed to get back to normal. How do we do what we need to do to get back to normal? Does that mean that we're switching from an alternate site back to the repaired primary site, right? So this kicks in, the recovery plan kicks in when the continuity of operations plan is complete. Generally, it's very narrow and focused, and sometimes the BRP is just included as an appendice to the business continuity plan. Continuity of support plan focuses narrowly on the support of specific IT systems and applications. It also goes by the name of an IT contingency plan, and it really emphasizes IT over general business support. Your cyber incident response plan, that's exactly what it sounds like. It's how am I responding to disruptive cyber events? Network attacks, worms, viruses, Trojan horses, ransomware, somebody clicked the link, all that fun stuff. And then there's the occupant emergency plan. So this is the plan for things like health, life, and safety events. How am I evacuating people during a fire? How am I dealing with active shooter? How am I dealing with heart attacks? Do my staff know where the AEDs are? Have they been trained on the use of those AEDs? So on and so forth. Generally, it's going to be very focused around the facility itself, and these should be things like do your drills, your evacuation drills, fire drills, tornado drills, hurricane drills, whatever your disaster model is. And then you want to make sure you've got specific safety roles that have been defined, and somebody should be the safety warden or meeting point leader. In bigger companies, I've seen this done by floor, where each physical floor of the office building had a floor warden, and they were responsible for ensuring the safety of all the employees on that floor. Then there's the crisis management plan, and really, a lot of businesses right now wish they would have had one of these for pandemics, because they didn't. A lot of them didn't. And so it's going to provide coordination of the managers in the organization in case something disruptive happens or an emergency happens. It's going to let the management know what they need to do to ensure the safety of health and life of their personnel and their property, and make sure that everybody can be protected. And then how are they going to communicate, right? So a crisis communication plan has different components. Sometimes it's just a communication plan, but basically it's how are you going to communicate? Who's going to say what? When are they going to say it? Who are they going to say it to? Okay? Call trees, again, really important. Call tree is going to say who gets called, and if they don't answer, who do I call next? You want to make sure that you have two-way reporting if you can. You want to make sure you have alternative contact methods in case primary methods are unavailable. So if I have your office phone number, that's a primary method. I probably need your cell phone number as an alternate method. And you want to make sure that each person knows the next person in the tree to call. Print these out. I can't stress that enough. Here's an example of what one looks like. So as you can see, the high-level manager calls down to his frontline managers, who then in turn call down to the specific employees. right? So there's usually a hierarchy in a call tree. This one flows down, but they can also flow up, right? If I'm the guy on the third shift and I found something, I might call my supervisor. We're definitely not calling the high-level manager at 2 in the morning until we're pretty sure we've got a reason to do so. Then you can have automated call trees. So this could be, something like one of the alerts goes off, which then triggers a phone call, email, web transaction. Really sensitive systems will have this set up, and then you have to acknowledge a receipt of the transaction if it is a callback type system. And generally they're off-site and provided by a third party to you. Crisis management plan. A subset of this is the Emergency Operations Center. So this is the command post that you set up right after the emergency occurs. So depending on who's and what are available depends on where you're going to put this thing. But basically it's the command and control center that you're going to be working out of throughout the duration of the emergency. Then you want to make sure that vital records are stored off-site and in a format that will allow access during a disaster. So back to, you need to print it off, so have both electronic and hard copy versions of all vital records. This is contact information for staff. These could be licensing information, support contracts, service level agreements, diagrams, circuits, network diagrams, all kinds of stuff that you're going to need to have as those vital records that you're going to need to get restored when you need to go through that process. So make sure that you have them, make sure that they're off-site, and you have the means to access them both digitally as well as physically. All right. Woo! We made it. I hope you guys all kept up with me. I hope you guys heard me. I think you did. The admins didn't say anything. So tonight we left off on page 411 in the book. We are off for Memorial Day on Monday, so there will be no class Monday, Memorial Day. We will resume again on Wednesday with executive succession planning, and I'm going to check my calendar. It looks like Evan's teaching that class. So come with questions. Take advantage of the opportunity over the weekend here to get caught up on that reading. And if anybody has any questions, pop them in the chat real quick. I'll answer a couple questions if you guys want. Otherwise, I can give you 15 minutes of your night back. You choose. Chat looks pretty quiet. All right, well, I think with that, I'll leave this up for just a few minutes, but thank you guys for attending, and look forward to seeing you again next week, and good luck with your studies.